this, our final panel of the day, on the important topic of necessity, proportionality, and utility. Like our previous panels, we will hear from each of our distinguished guests. When all three have concluded, we will open it up for your questions and your comments. We'll begin by hearing from Professor Thomas HURKA, who is Chancellor Henry N.R. Jackman, Distinguished Professor of Philosophical Studies at the University of Toronto. He works in moral and political philosophy and is the author of several books, including Perfectionism, Virtue, Vice, and Value, and The Best Things in Life. He has also written on ethics and war, focusing especially on issues of proportionality and necessity, and the role of liability in determining both what are just causes for war and who are legitimate targets in war. So without further ado, I turn it over to Professor HURKA.
Thanks. So Ed Barrett asked me to say some general things about proportionality and necessity, and I'll try and do that. As Michael Walzer said at lunch, proportionality is an elastic concept. I'm going to try to add a little bit of stiffening to it, but it can't eliminate all the looseness. Because I think all of you know, proportionality and necessity are conditions that appear in both the jus ad bellum and the jus in bello. So in the jus ad bellum, proportionality says that the resort to war is unjustified if the damage the war will cause is disproportionate to the relevant good it will secure. In the jus in bello, a parallel condition says a particular tactic in war is unjustified if the harm it will cause, in particular the collateral harm it will cause to civilians, is disproportionate to its benefits. And these proportionality conditions are twinned with necessity conditions, which say that the resort to war, or a particular tactic in war, is unjustified if its benefits, or one's close to it, could have been achieved by less destructive means. Thus, a war is unjustified because it's not necessary or not a last resort if its ends could have been achieved by diplomacy. And bombing a bridge in daytime, when there are cars going back and forth across it, is unjustified if the same military benefit could have been achieved by bombing it at night when it's empty. Now, I see the necessity conditions as dependent on the proportionality conditions, and more specifically as comparative versions of them. So to apply the jus ad bellum necessity condition, or as it's often called the last resort condition, this is the way I see it. We do a proportionality assessment for each of war and its relevant alternatives to determine the net balance of relevant goods over evils for each one of those. And then only if war has the best net balance, i.e. if no alternative such as diplomacy has better net effects, for example, the same benefits at less cost, is the resort to war permitted. So as I see it, the necessity conditions are parasitic on the proportionality conditions as further applications of them, and it's the initial proportionality conditions that I'm going to focus on, and I'm going to start talking about ad bellum proportionality. I guess most of the discussion today about proportionality has been about the in bello condition. And the basic idea here is that the relevant harms caused by war must not be disproportionate to the relevant good that war will do. And that leads, I think, fairly straightforwardly to three questions you have to ask to understand what proportionality means in this context. First, what are the relevant goods of war, the relevant benefits that war can achieve? Two, what are the relevant evils of war? What counts on the negative side of the scale? And three, very difficultly, of course, how do you weigh the goods and evils against each other? Now, some writers have given a comparatively simple answer to all these questions at once. They've said that the relevant goods are all the goods that will result from war, of whatever kind and whatever way they will result. And the relevant evils are all the evils that will result, again, of whatever kind and whatever way they'll result. And then you have to weigh the two against each other equally. So a war counts as proportionate if and only if it will result in somewhat more good than it will result in evil. And I think, I don't know whether he believes it now, but some of James Johnson's writings have interpreted proportionality in that way. But I think, at least my view is that you can question that simple answer, that simple understanding of proportionality at several points. So let me start with the first question: what are the relevant goods of war? Now, the simple view is that all the goods, no matter what they are, count in war's favor for purposes of proportionality. Well, here's an example. Imagine that our economy and the world's economy are now in a serious economic depression. And fighting a war would end this depression, boost GDP, the way that fighting the Second World War ended the depression of the 1930s. Now that's a real benefit of the war and a significant size benefit. But my sense is that it doesn't count as a relevant benefit of the war. A war can't be proportionate, that would otherwise have been disproportionate because it'll boost global GDP. Some other more trivial examples, but that illustrate the same point. I mean, fighting a war might be exciting for soldiers who are bored of exercises and want the thrill of real combat. The pleasure they would get from fighting is not a big benefit, but it's not a relevant benefit. It's not of the right kind. And a war might lead to the production of great art. Guernica, All Quiet on the Western Front. Again, a war can't be, that would otherwise be disproportionate can't be proportionate because it would lead to more profound art that would otherwise have been produced. So I think there are some goods that are not relevant to proportionality. Only some are, and the question is which ones are they? I think a traditional and quite restrictive view says it's only the goods in the war's principal just causes. So in the 1991 Gulf War, only the goods involved or consequent on ending Iraq's occupation of Kuwait counted as relevant benefits. In the Afghanistan War of 2001, only the elimination of al-Qaeda training sites counted as a relevant benefit. But I think that view is too restrictive. Where's Jeff? In an old article, Jeff McCain distinguished between what he's at some point called independent just causes, which are just causes, which are benefits that satisfy the just cause condition and provide a just cause for war, with what he called conditional just causes. Independent just causes are things like resisting aggression. And what he called conditional just causes, which can't on their own justify a war. If all you've got are conditional causes, you're not permitted to fight. But conditional causes are such that if you've got some other independent just cause, they become legitimate aims in war, and their achievement can count in favor of the war as being proportional. So what are some of these conditional just causes? One is disarming a potential aggressor. Let's assume that the mere fact that a state has got weapons that it might use for aggression in the future does not justify war against it now. If that state has committed aggression, then forcibly disarming it becomes a legitimate aim, and the fact that the war would degrade its military, so it would be incapable of further aggressions in the future, is a relevant benefit. Another, I think, is deterrence. Again, I assume it would be not sufficient the mere fact that initiating a war against a state would deter other states from aggressions in the future does not justify war against the first state now. But if a state has committed aggression, then the fact that resisting the aggression will deter future aggression, either by it or by other states, is a benefit, I think, that counts in favor of the war. To go back to Jeff's example of the Falklands War, I mean, it may be that there were only 1,800 islanders and that their self-determination wasn't sufficient to make that war proportionate. But if the war also deterred future aggressors, or perhaps more realistically, failed to encourage future aggressors, as letting an aggression stand would do, that is a further factor that counts in favor of war. Well, there are some other of these conditional just causes, but I think what I want to suggest is that the relevant goods for the purposes of proportionality are just those in the independent and conditional just causes. And they don't include side effects of war, such as economic growth, pleasure for soldiers, technological advances like radar, and so on. I've just been talking about the relevant goods for the jus ad bellum, but what about the jus in bello? And here, I can't see a difference. I guess I'm with Jeff on this point. I don't see how you can understand the relevant goods that we're supposed to weigh the harm a particular tactic will cause against, except in terms of the ultimate just causes of the war and what contribution this act will make to the achievement of those just causes. And sort of one argument in favor of that is just imagine that there's a tactic that is vital to success in something like World War II against a genocidal enemy such as Nazi Germany. And then there's another tactic which is equally vital to success in a war where what's at stake is something like what was at stake in the Falklands War. I take it that there's a level of collateral damage that would be harm to civilians that would be permissible in the first case that would not be permissible in the second case. And you can only say that if you say you're weighing the harm of this particular tactic against contribution to the just causes, which are so much more weighty in the World War II case than in the Falklands case. So that's my take on relevant goods. What about relevant evils? Now here, I don't think there's any exclusion parallel to that for relevant goods. I said that the economic benefits of war don't count in favor of its being proportional. But what about economic harms? What if fighting a war would plunge the world into economic recession or depression? I think that's a relevant harm that counts against any benefits of the war. I said the pleasure soldiers would get from real action doesn't count, but the pain of soldiers certainly counts as a negative effect for proportionality purposes. And I think if a fighting a war set back the development of art in a serious way, that would also be a relevant negative effect. So whereas I think that only some resulting goods count in favor of a war as being proportional, all or virtually all resulting evils count against it. So in that way, you can see there's a thumb pressed down on the negative side of the proportionality scale, since more counts on that side than counts on the positive side. But there may be a compensating thumb pressed down on the other side. Now, I assume that the relevant goods of war count towards its proportionality no matter how they're caused, and in particular, even if they depend on future morally right decisions of other agents. So in the case of deterrence, let's say our fighting a war now will deter future aggression because it'll lead state actors in the future to decide rightly not to initiate aggression when they otherwise would have. The fact that that good depends on a later right decision by a political leader doesn't stop it, the deterrence, from being a relevant benefit of the war we're fighting now. But it's not so clear that evils count or count fully if they also depend on wrong decisions by other agents. So one of my examples is, imagine that we're deciding whether to defend our state against aggression by our neighbor A. We know that if we succeed, we may know that if we succeed, our military success will lead our other neighbors, C and D, to build up their militaries. Look how useful a military is, leading to an arms race and eventual war between them. Do we have to count the harms that war will involve fully against the proportionality of our resisting A now? I would say surely not. If C and D go to war, that will be because of a wrongful decision they or one of them makes to initiate war. And even if that decision wouldn't have been made, except for our resistance to A now, the evil of their war is mostly their responsibility and not ours. I've got another example where if we fight a war with a just cause and defeat an enemy, suicide bombers on the other side will have launched attacks on civilians. So which they wouldn't attack otherwise, or they wouldn't launch otherwise. So that just look at the deaths of the suicide bombers. Do we have to count it as a relevant negative effect that counts against the proportionality of our fighting this war, that it will lead to the deaths of suicide bombers? I'm inclined to say no, because it's their decision to launch a suicide attack, and the fact that their wrongful decision, even though it wouldn't have been made but for our fighting the war now, the fact that it's their decision reduces our, in fact, in that case, severs entirely our responsibility for the resulting harm. Now that leads me to the topic that Michael Walzer was talking about at lunch, namely of involuntary shields. This is where our enemy purposely places military facilities such as rocket launchers or an anti-aircraft battery among civilians so that we can't attack it without harming those civilians. Does this fact, I've now switched to in bello proportionality, I'm sure you all noticed. Does this fact that the civilians were wrongly placed there by the enemy affect our assessment of the proportionality of attack on this facility? Now, this case is different from that of the suicide bombers because it's not the civilian's own choice that puts them in danger, it's somebody else's choice. But it is a wrongful choice that put them there, and the question is whether that makes the civilian's deaths in part the other's responsibility so they can count less against the proportionality of our action. This is Michael Walzer's question from lunchtime. I guess I agree with, maybe it was a comment of David Rodin's, that we shouldn't actually talk in terms of responsibility, because that tends to make it sound as if responsibility is zero-sum. I mean, it could be that the enemy is wholly responsible for the deaths, and we're wholly responsible for the deaths. The real question is whether, when we assess the proportionality of our attack, do we sort of discount the harms to the civilians whose lives will be lost, let us say, because they're only in harm's way because they were wrongfully put there by the enemy. Now, I find this a very difficult question philosophically with arguments on both sides. On the one side, you can say, and I'm sure a utilitarian would say, that we have to make choices in the world as we find it and not try to avoid responsibility for the effects of the choices we make in a given situation because we disapprove morally of the way the situation came about. On the other side, we can say that an enemy shouldn't be protected by his morally bad character. So the more wrongfully he acts, the less we can do against him. I find these arguments hard to weigh against each other, in particular, since intuitive responses to different cases are different. And we could actually have lots of different cases, which I won't trouble you with. But it's an extremely important issue in the current context. as others have mentioned, because of the actions, the military actions against insurgent groups who regularly place military facilities amongst civilians. So Hamas and Hezbollah, the targets of Israeli actions, have placed military facilities, rocket launchers, and so on in civilian locations. And I think, in the public debates about those actions, the people who roundly condemn Israel, I think, are assuming that how the civilians got there doesn't matter. I mean, they were there, and whose responsibility is that they were there doesn't matter, and therefore they make a negative assessment of proportionality. I think the Israeli military takes the view that it does matter how the civilians got there. The deaths are discounted, and if different verdicts are reached, it's because the competing sides are making different judgments. As I say, I found this a difficult issue. I'd be interested to hear the views of others, particularly those in the military who have to make decisions about this sort of thing. I've read some newspaper reports from U.S. military commanders, for example, in the Iraq War, which suggested that they thought responsibility, that there was discounting of civilian deaths when civilians were put in harm's way by the enemy. As I say, I think that's the view of the Israeli military. I should say, when I first wrote about this topic, I thought that, morality aside, the law was quite clear, because Additional Protocol 1, while condemning the use of civilians as shields, also has a clause that says the violation by one party of its obligations under this protocol does not release the other side from its obligations under this protocol. And I took that to imply that if the enemy has wrongfully placed shields, places military facilities near civilians, that doesn't change our obligation not to cause disproportionate harm to those civilians. But that's me reading it as a philosopher and not a lawyer. And thanks to The Economist and David Roden, I was alerted to an analysis of the laws of armed conflict produced by the UK military based on the assessments of their military lawyers. And they take the view that if civilians have been placed near a military target by the enemy, that, I'm quoting it roughly, that counts in favor of the attackers in determining proportionality. They don't say how much it counts in favor, but their interpretation, I'm sure controversial, of international law is that the placement of civilians by the enemy near a military facility reduces the weight those civilians' deaths have. They don't say by how much in the assessment of proportionality that we make if we're contemplating attacking that facility. I find this a very difficult question. I think there are credible arguments on both sides. It's about whether evils count towards the proportionality, whether how much an evil effect of our action counts towards the proportionality of the action depends on whether the fact that that evil will result is partly the responsibility of a wrongful choice by somebody else, in particular our enemy. I don't have much time left, but that leads me to question 3 about weighing goods versus evils. And this is obviously immensely difficult topic. And here in particular, we're not going to be saying this has 7, this counts 7, and this counts 9, and this counts 23. You have to weigh preservation of national sovereignty against the killing of soldiers, the collateral killing of civilians. Those are very difficult things to do. But I will address in 2.5 minutes one key issue. And that's actually the question that Michael Walzer mentioned, namely, how do we make decisions when we're choosing between the lives of, or risk to the lives of, our soldiers versus the lives of, or risks to the lives of civilians on the other side? Now, I should have said, actually, when I was discussing in bello proportionality, that the relevant goods include not just the war's just causes, or contributions to those, but also reducing the harm the war will cause, for example, to our soldiers. And so there's a familiar choice between tactics that lower the risk to our soldiers at the cost of raising the risk to enemy civilians. You can think of the large-scale bombing of Iraq's infrastructure, which happened well behind the lines, the front lines in Kuwait in the 1991 war, or the decision in the Kosovo war that NATO made to fly its planes only above 15,000 feet, where they were out of the range of anti-aircraft fire, but where the risk of inaccurate bombing with civilian casualties was greater. So we have to make some sort of rough weighing between the lives of soldiers on our side and civilians on the other. It seems to me that there are arguments favoring both sides, Concerning our soldiers, well, first, they're our compatriots. And I think governments and its officials have not only the permission, but in general a duty to prefer their compatriots' interests to those of foreigners. In addition, I think military commanders have a special responsibility to the soldiers under their command to protect them from harm, including by not exposing them to the risk of harm. On the other hand, the civilians on the other side are civilians. They haven't taken on the status of soldiers, and they therefore don't have a status that involves the permissibility of their being killed in wartime. I actually disagree with Jeff and David about what makes soldiers liable to be killed. I assume that if you have the status of soldier, you're someone whose death in war is not an injustice. Now, our soldiers do have that status. The civilians on the other side do not. So favoring our soldiers is the fact that they're our compatriots, that as military commanders we have additional special duties towards them. On the other hand, favoring the civilians on the other side is the fact that they are not soldiers, they are civilians. I find those competing considerations very hard to weigh against each other, but there is one further consideration, and that is that if we choose the tactic that is more protective of our soldiers, we will actively kill the civilians. We will have directly caused their deaths. We won't have intended their deaths in the double effect sense, but we will have actively caused their deaths. Whereas if we choose the tactic that has more risk for our soldiers, we won't have actively caused their death. Somebody else will have actively caused their death. Many people think that's a morally relevant consideration, and to me that tips the scale in favor of the enemy civilians, so that the right choice to make in that situation is to accept greater risks, somewhat greater risks for our soldiers in order to avoid somewhat lesser risks to civilians on the other side. But I'm not terribly, I'm not totally convinced by that. I mean, the issues are very difficult to weigh, and you certainly can't say anything very precise about it. So that was an attempt at a quick survey of issues about proportionality.
Thank you, Dr. HURKA. And thanks for so carefully abiding by our stringent time limits. Next, we will hear from George Lucas. George Lucas is class of 1984, Distinguished Chair in Ethics in the Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the U.S. Naval Academy, and Professor of Ethics and Public Policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. He has taught at several universities, including Georgetown University, Emory University, the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, and served as Philosophy Department Chairman at the University of Santa Clara in California. He has received research fellowships from the Fulbright Commission and the American Council of Learned Societies, and has served 3 times as Director of National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institutes for college and university faculty. He's a summa cum laude graduate in physics from the College of William and Mary, received his PhD in philosophy from Northwestern University. He's also the author of 5 books, more than 40 journal articles, translations, and book reviews, and has also edited 8 book-length collections of articles in philosophy and ethics. His most recent book is Anthropologists in Arms, The Ethics of Military Anthropology. Turn it over to Dr. Lucas.
Thank you. The task we had this afternoon was to, after the discussion of the panel on just causes, was to think somewhat about some of the other categories of just war theory. Proportionality is indeed an elastic and elusive concept, and Professor HURKA's work, which we've studied in our fellow seminar, along with Professor McMahon's, Jeff McMahon's, has done a lot, I think, to elucidate how we are to understand that concept of proportionality and how to carry out those calculations. And indeed, a lot of Professor HURKA's work shows that some of the other categories, or indeed many of the other categories of the traditional classical just war tradition, can be, in a sense, shown to be covered or to have the work, proportionality will do the work that they're designed to do in some sense. They have a proportionality dimension. Things like probability of success, obviously, but even as this conversation suggests, just causes, and certainly necessity in the sense of last resort. So what I'd like to do in contrast, and this is driven in part by some of those military technologies in particular that were mentioned just as a category in passing in the last presentation, is to suggest that last resort turns out to be a very important category in the tradition, independent of proportionality calculations, in fact, and it's so foundational that I'm going to argue in a kind of perverse way late in the afternoon that most of the work of the tradition can be done by this concept properly understood. And that's because I'm going to argue that the principle in no way entails the comparative utilitarian calculations most frequently associated with it. Instead, it's entirely a matter of principle. Read between the lines, you've got a recalcitrant old-style Kantian caught between two utilitarians late in the afternoon, so I'm trying to be a little perverse. I realize this is a strange proposal to entertain. Michael Walzer is famously skeptical of the genuine value of the guidance purportedly offered by this criterion, since, as he remarks, there is, quote, always something more to do, another diplomatic note, another UN resolution, another meeting. And from an historical perspective, the criterion of last resort appears only sporadically and intermittently in the classical canonical lists of just war criteria, at least in the Western tradition. It does not appear at all in the list of justifiability criteria offered by Thomas, Vittoria, or Suarez, for example, though Suarez does comment elsewhere on the constraint. Last resort is invoked explicitly by Erasmus and importantly by Hugo Grotius, from whence, as James Turner Johnson complains, it makes its way gradually and covertly into international law and into contemporary reformulations of the classical tradition. There, the criterion that war always be pursued as the option of last resort helps supplant a once overriding concern for the restoration of justice and responsible exercise of sovereignty to protect the innocent that, Johnson argues, and you heard some of this argument this afternoon, once constituted the core of the classical tradition. The principle of last resort literally elbows aside this concern for justice in favor of a presumption against war and against the use of force generally, advocated illicitly by, among others, people that Jim calls crypto-pacifists within the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, precisely to make the resort to war in pursuit of an otherwise justifiable cause well nigh impossible to sustain. As historical scholars know full well, like Jim, the principle of last resort is much older than this account would suggest. It originates in the secular pre-Christian accounts of justifications for going to war, where it enjoys pride of place, to which I'd like to restore it now, as the principal consideration to be satisfied before resorting to war. It is not, explicitly at least, either the reasons for or the intentions behind a nation's appeal to war that finally matter. Those are assumed to be otherwise legitimate affairs of state. Rather, what matters is, whatever the nature of the dispute, that the adversaries make every conceivable good faith effort to avoid resorting to war to resolve it. This is evident in Cicero's account of last resort in De Officiis, grounded in the ancient Roman Republican custom of the fetiale, or priestly ambassadors of the Senate, whose role in warning potential adversaries of an imminent war was part of a required religious ritual that we now know as public declaration. We owe it, I believe, to Greg Reichberg and Henrik Suess and their young colleague Endred Begbie for pointing out that this is functionally a requirement that war always constitute a last resort, with public declaration merely denoting the elaborate procedure by which that constraint was once guaranteed in the ancient world. In a sense, this public declaration thing, if I may for a moment dwell on it, is badly misunderstood. When you see it cited now in some of the lists of just war criteria, it tends to get interpreted in a very culturally specific way. Say, in the U.S., we have it's the Congress's prerogative to declare war, and then the President, Commander-in-Chief, carries it out. Obviously, that doesn't itself carry over into other legitimate forms of sovereignty, but that's what that discussion looks like it's referencing, is legitimate authority. Whereas on the account that, not just that I'm giving it, but that we discover is the historically accurate account on Henrik and Greg's and Endra's work, it is not, public declaration is not a discussion of legitimate authority. It is a guarantee, a procedure to guarantee that war is always a last resort. All that said, why should I now advocate elevating this quaint pagan religious ritual that functioned as little more than window dressing for self-aggrandizing Roman imperial ambitions into the preeminent concern in contemporary just war discourse? there's a serious reason behind the proposal, and it's a grave concern provoked by the increasingly rapid pace of lethal military technologies, the dimensions of which were the subject of last year's McCain conference. All of those technologies, robotics, non-lethal weapons, virtual cyber conflict, offer prospects of enhancing the reach of the warfighter, making it safer for warriors to engage in combat, and by their precision and sophistication, reducing the widespread destruction and indiscriminate killing that figure so large in proportionality calculations. Precisely in so doing, paradoxically, they raise what I collectively term the threshold problem. That is, each distinctive technology, by making warfare more precise and less destructive, threatens to lower the threshold for going to war and erode the last resort concept. This warning was first explicitly raised in a seminal essay on ethics and information warfare by John Arquilla at the RAND Corporation in the late 1990s. John, who actually coined the term cyber warfare, he's the one who invented it, is my colleague in defense analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School. But one also finds echoes of this concern, for example, in the work of Michael Ignatieff on virtual war in the aftermath of the Kosovo air campaign. The more precise we can make war, the more precision weapons we develop, the more likely we can use them and justify using them via the proportionality calculations of the sort that Professor HURKA suggested. Also, you find this concern raised with the rapid advent of not just precision weaponry in the 1990s, but now military robotics, soldier enhancements, and non-lethal weapons in the past decade in the work of people like Pete Singer in his book, Wired for War. He raises this concern many times. Going to lower the threshold. We're going to go to war more readily. Article in the New York Times on this topic, November of this past year. A report sponsored by the Office of Naval Research and authored by my young colleague Patrick Lynn, last year's Stockdale Fellow, and the father of American robotics, George Becky, raises this report over and over and over and over again in the literature on military technologies and warfighting. You will see the threshold problem raised with respect to all the advent of all these new ways of pursuing warfighting. That threshold problem is generated, however, by interpreting last resort as Professor HURKA does, wholly as, in effect, he writes, a comparative version of the initial simple proportionality condition. This is a quote from a paper of his in 2005, very widely read and very influential and helpful. For war and each of its alternatives, one does a proportionality calculation, identifying the relevant goods and evils, with a focus on relevant, that it will produce compared to a baseline of doing nothing or continuing to act as one would have had acted if there had been no just cause, and then says the war is permitted only if its net outcome is better than those of all alternatives. That's a quote from that paper, but you heard a similar formulation this afternoon. If HURKA is correct, and indeed if the prevailing interpretations of last resort by Brian Oren, Martin Cook, the Catholic bishops, and many others, almost everybody in fact, as entailing essentially a comparative calculation of the net utility of warfighting compared to its alternatives, then these recent concerns for what Arquilla first termed the erosion of the principle do follow, because the warfighting technologies in question all promise to transform those comparative calculations of proportionality in dramatic fashion. At its heart, however, that quaint Roman religious custom seems normatively to entail good faith efforts to explore alternatives before presuming to cross what Martin Cook in his account defines as a very bright line, going to war. And that language doesn't sound like a proportionality or utility calculation at bottom, but instead seems to invoke a principle. That HURKA's, and indeed nearly everyone's, customary utilitarian interpretation of the last resort principle of necessity are incorrect, in fact, I believe can be easily demonstrated, and that demonstration helps ameliorate this widespread current anxiety about technology that wars will inevitably become, as a result, easier to fight. Last resort is not uniquely a category or criterion of just war discourse, as I indicated earlier, but it is invariably and consistently a category in any and every moral discussion of exemption or exception. Indeed, in all of these discussions, the principle of last resort always figures as the key, essential, or core consideration, the sole necessary consideration, if you will, in deciding to make oneself an exception or grant oneself an exemption to rules or principles that otherwise are considered inviolable and universally applicable. The last resort criterion is essential to discussions, therefore, of lying and truth-telling, to the use of force generally, as in domestic law enforcement or in cases of individual self-defense, to killing particularly, as well as to disobeying orders, conscientious objection, or civil disobedience and the law. We are, in general, beseeched not to do these things, not to kill or to lie or to use force to settle disputes or disobey a lawful order or disobey or disrespect the law itself. When we nonetheless do any of these things, we're at minimum required to provide a compelling reason or justification, to be sure, but even more importantly, we are required to have first engaged in good faith attempts at less drastic alternatives before engaging in the proscribed behavior. This last resort requirement is imposed not because of the calculus of consequences, which famously can often be, or at least seem, quite favorable to the otherwise proscribed behavior, as in many instances of lying. Rather, it serves as a side constraint on such calculations. It depends, that is, the last resort or necessity criterion depends, notwithstanding the results of the calculations. It demands that we do not willingly violate principles that we otherwise properly hold to rightly constrain our own and everyone else's permissible conduct in these otherwise disparate matters. In all these instances of breaking rules or exempting oneself from morality's standard operating procedures, one is required first to attempt less drastic alternatives, not drastic in the sense of degree of destruction, as wrongly thought in the case of war, but in terms of violation of principle, to have made every attempt, that is to say, to avoid having to violate the principle in question, lest, as Cicero remarks in the case of war, we invoke the wrath of the gods. In sum, if the principle of last resort is interpreted, as nearly everyone does interpret it, as simply another in a list of proportionality considerations entailing a comparative calculus of expected net utility values, then the pundits and critics of emerging military technologies, and for that matter, the increased reliance on private military contractors, are correct. These calculations are all subject to change as we factor in their increased reliance on contractors and robots, or the increasing availability of non-lethal weapons or cyber weapons. Any principle or rule of thumb grounded in such calculations as the critics fear are thus subject to erosion. On my interpretation of the origins and proper understanding of the last resort principle, however, these developments in themselves have no bearing whatsoever on the decision to resort to war. One remains obligated to attempt in good faith not having to resort to war, because wars, like lying and killing and law-breaking, are things we generally disapprove of and do not think it morally right for ourselves or anyone else to undertake. And that remains the case no matter what weapons or tactics we develop or bring to the table. And it demonstrates decisively, as I've long maintained, that the discussion of war needs to be included in this wider deontological family of moral discourse about exceptions or exemptions generally, from which it has, throughout its otherwise venerable history, strangely been isolated. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Lucas, and thank you for the wonderful use of the word beseech. We don't hear that enough in our dialogue and discourse. Our final panelist of the day is William H. Shaw, A.B. Stanford, Ph.D., London School of Economics and Political Science, and Professor of Philosophy at San Jose State University, where he was chair of the philosophy department for 11 years and the university's 1988-1999 President Scholar. Bill has also been a Fulbright lecturer and a von Humboldt Fellow and served for 2 years as the resident director of the California State University's System Study Abroad program at the University of Zimbabwe. In addition to essays in a variety of professional journals, he is the author of Marx's Theory of History, More on Right and Wrong, Contemporary Ethics Taking Account of Utilitarianism, Business Ethics, and with Vincent Barry, Moral Issues in Business. He is also currently a fellow at the Stockdale Center. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Let me begin by thanking Colonel Art Athens and his colleagues for extending to me the privilege of being at the Naval Academy this year. It's been, unfortunately, time is winding down now, but it's been a great pleasure and a great benefit to me personally, so I thank you and your colleagues very much. I might, among his many colleagues, mention especially Ed Barrett, who directs the fellow seminar, and in addition, of course, to being responsible for organizing this conference. And most of the people that we've heard from today are people we've read in our seminar, and same tomorrow, and several of them have been kind enough to come to Annapolis and speak with us, or in the case of David Roden, by transatlantic telephone call to communicate with us. So it's a little bit intimidating to come at the end of this August group, especially when you're defending a position that you know they all disagree with, because I'm going to take up the cudgels for the utilitarian approach to when it's legitimate to wage war. It sort of fits in with our previous speakers, because if George Wright, Professor HURKA wants to sort of expand proportionality to include everything else, and George wants to expand last resort to include everything else, and I'm going to use utility to include everything else that we should be taking account of when we go to war. It's also a little bit uncomfortable to be a utilitarian and sort of standing between you and the buffet in a few minutes. Whether you want to drink beer and play pushpin with Bentham, or sip single malt and talk art with John Stewart and Harriet Taylor Mill, either way, it's her problem. But so I would try to be succinct and just give you a few points from a longer paper that I'm working on that you're happy to write me for a copy if you've been interested in it. So I'll sort of kind of gesture at some of the things that I'm interested in or some of the points I want to make. To begin with, well, I'll sort of state the sort of basic utilitarian view of war and say a couple things in its favor and try to situate it with respect to the traditional principles of just war theory with respect to the ad bellum aspect of war. Utilitarian principle with regard to war is pretty simple. It holds that it's morally right for a state to wage war if and only if no other course of action would have better results, or more specifically, if and only if no other course of action would result in greater expected well-being. Otherwise, it's wrong to wage war. Now, there's a lot that's simple and straightforward, and there's lots of behind-the-scenes intramural debate among utilitarians and consequentialists about exactly how to formulate that standard, and I won't go into that. I'll just mention a couple brief things about the interpretation of that very simple principle. One is there's different kinds of wars that can be fought, various strengths of war, types of war, and of course that's going to be considered by the utilitarian criteria, because what you're comparing is the particular type of war you're entertaining fighting versus other possible wars, or no war at all, or other kinds of action that you may take. Likewise, or not likewise, but similarly, the utilitarian criteria is about waging war, not just about going to war as if it were a one-time decision. Utilitarianism is a notoriously forward-looking criteria, and so it's possible that you were justified in utilitarian grounds or not in going to war or not going to war, but some years farther down the road, the situation may be changed, and so you may be justified now in continuing to fight or stopping fighting, whereas just the reverse of what you were before. Finally, just on the kind of preliminary contents, there's a sort of asymmetry in practice in many wars, in that the costs of the war are sort of going to be upfront and immediate and undeniable. That people will be killed, maimed, things destroyed, life disrupted. Whereas often the looked for benefits are farther in the future and a little less secure. Now that doesn't affect the deep logic of the utilitarian criterion, but in practice, that epistemic imbalance may give you some pause when you're reflecting on the possibility of war from a utilitarian point of view. You may want to put your thumb a little bit more heavily on the scale against war when it's all the negative things are virtually certain, and the positive ones, even though they might in principle justify the harm that's going to occur, are a little less certain. Looking at sort of non-philosophically, if you look back through human history, there would be or would have been quite a difference if people had looked at war in terms of this simple utilitarian criterion. Very few wars have been fought with any regard at all for the consequences of the war for people on the other side. And even with respect to one's own side, when consequences have been entertained at all, it's only rarely that they've been consequences spelled out specifically for how they'll affect individual people now and in the future. There's some talk about that in the early seminars, the importance of the individual, emphasizing the individual, for utilitarians, individual's well-being, and that's a kind of hallmark feature of utilitarianism. And finally, it's rare, or has been rare for either side to have given much really detailed, serious, empirical thought to what will be the possible gains and losses from a conflict. Of course, it's very common for any side to believe or to claim that the stakes are extremely high and that defeat is unimaginable and great goods are at stake, but it's rare for those claims to actually be warranted or to be justified or even well defended. Whereas I think if utilitarianism were taken seriously as the ultimate criteria for when it's legitimate to wage war, there'd be a stronger emphasis to actually look more carefully at those things. If you're a utilitarian, then of course you're going to gravitate toward the utilitarian criteria of when a war is right or when a war is wrong. But what I put forward, what I stated to you, the idea that a war is, it's right for a state to wage war if and only if nothing else it could do would yield greater expected benefit, that's a sort of fairly specific normative principle of a limited domain, which I believe you can accept from other moral perspectives. You don't have to be a utilitarian to agree that that's the right criteria for judging when a war is morally correct or incorrect. Now, how could that be? Well, one easy way is you could not be a utilitarian because you're a consequentialist of some other stripe. So, but put that aside. Suppose you're just an ordinary non-consequentialist, like probably the majority of you are. I think you have to take account of the fact that the utilitarian criteria that I stated corresponds to common sense. I think it's very hard it would be very hard for ordinary people to believe that it's right to fight a war if the consequences of doing so on balance are going to be worse than the consequences of not having fought that war. And if you have suitably broad understanding of what constitutes human well-being, so that includes, as it would for Mill and other great utilitarians, freedom, self-determination, then you could go all the way, from the point of view of common sense, to endorse the utilitarian criteria that war is justified only if human beings as a whole are better off as a result of it than they would have been if you hadn't fought the war. For most non-consequentialists allow some role for consequences in their moral judgments. And that's especially true when the choices they're making have the potential to affect the well-being of many, many people in really serious ways. So even if you believe that utilitarian is not the whole answer, you may well think that consequences are really what matters in these kinds of choices where what's at stake are the really serious factors affecting human well-being on a large scale. So what I'm suggesting, I can't prove it, is that many non-consequentialists will find or could find the utilitarian criteria of when war is morally right to be an acceptable middle-level normative principle, the validity of which is evident on reflection and which coheres, I think, with judgments we want to make about what wars are right and what wars are wrong or have been right or have been wrong in human history. I'd like to add along the same line that many of the reasons philosophers have for rejecting utilitarianism, the idea that it's insensitive to distribution, that it demands too much of individuals, that it conflicts with ordinary moral rules, that it's too impersonal or coldly calculating, that it ignores our individual attachments or personal commitments or the specific obligations we have, that it falters as a personal ethic. I think all these criticisms, whatever merit they have or don't have, are irrelevant as criticisms of the utilitarian criteria of when it's right for a state to wage a war. those common criticisms are irrelevant to the use of utilitarianism in this case of a large issue of public policy. The idea that it's too demanding and that it ignores personal obligations, I think those are sort of irrelevant. That in these sorts of situations, like making a judgment about the rightness or wrongness of war, are exactly when we want decision makers to be impartial, to be dispassionate, to be coldly calculating, to be rational deliberators who try to look at the big picture and just focus on the consequences. Now, even so, there are going to be objections to the utilitarian criteria of war. Let me just say simply, because one would be that utilitarian calculations are abused or could be abused. And that's true, but that's also true for all sorts of just war thinking, that it can be and has been abused. Critics, even of this limited principle, this limited utilitarian principle about war, would think that the consequences of our choices are unforeseeable. And that, of course, that has to be granted. We don't able to predict the future. And we can go on as utilitarians to add all the great types of mistakes people can make. They can overlook possible alternative courses of action. They can misjudge the probable effects of those courses of actions that they do consider, either by missing some of the outcomes they're likely to have or miscalculating those probabilities. Decision makers can have faulty background assumptions. They can suffer from bias, wishful thinking, all those cognitive errors having to do with framing and anchoring effects, as well as self-interest, emotion, social pressure. So lots of things can go wrong with everybody's reasoning, and certainly can go wrong with utilitarian reasoning. But I don't think the situation's hopeless, and we use this sort of reasoning in lots of other areas, and I think we can make judgments about at least some past wars that they were wrong, and perhaps about some past wars that they were right. And even if it's difficult about many wars to say whether they were right or wrong, that doesn't impugn in principle the right criteria. It just means some moral questions are difficult to resolve. Still, it'd be nice if we had some kind of useful way or some guidance in moving from this very abstract principle, this kind of high-level judgment about, at the end of the day, when is a war right or wrong, to practical action. And here I think that standard principles of jus ad bellum in just war theory can help. They can help provide a framework or guidance that utilitarians could avail themselves of. So I think even though these are logically incompatible or can give you logically different answers in theory, I think in practice would be very rare to find a war that satisfied suitably interpreted ad bellum principles and failed the utilitarian principle, and vice versa. Moreover, the ad bellum principles draw our attention to a series of discrete factors that are going to be important from a utilitarian point of view. I mean, some of them obviously are, like proportionality and last resort, but even ones like right intention and just cause have a utilitarian rationale behind them. And so by focusing your attention on those principles, I think you're more likely to get a judgment that ultimately satisfies the utilitarian criteria of when war is right than if you just try to kind of wing it by yourself. Moreover, those principles are widely known, utilized, they're taught at the service academy, so there's good reason for a utilitarian to want to avail himself of those principles and sort of in effect to adopt them as the lower level normative principles that we would use in our kind of workaday decisions about, and workaday decisions and sort of public debate about when it would be permissible to go to war or not. Again, making it more likely that by following those intermediate principles, or in Mill's phrase, intermediate generalizations, we'll be more likely to get the answer that would be correct from the abstract utilitarian perspective. Now, I'm not saying that the utilitarian principles should be abandoned in favor of the jus ad bellum principles, and that's for at least two reasons. First, those principles are not self-interpreting. They require elaboration and refinement, and the utilitarian criterion, or looking at it from the point of view of the ultimate utilitarian criteria of when war is right, would give you some framework for revising and refining those ad bellum principles. And secondly, the ad bellum principles, as I see them, today lack theoretical foundation. People either think they're just intuitively plausible, which to some extent they are, I agree, or it's a matter of tradition and we should just accept them because they've been handed down, they represent the wisdom of the ages. My colleague George Lucas refers to this as methodological anarchy in one of his essays, and so I think utilitarianism would give you a framework that could tie together and ultimately underpin those sometimes seemingly ad hoc ad bellum principles. I don't know how much time I have.
5 minutes.
Okay, let me just, I don't want to go too far into this because, you know, if you're not sort of sympathetic to utilitarianism, it won't be so interesting to you, but there's 2 or 3 different ways utilitarians can think about rules, and which of those ways is the way that I want us to think about the ad bellum rules? Well, one would be just to think of what are normally thought of as the moral rules as being just rules of thumb, that don't really have moral weight themselves, but are merely kind of pragmatic guidelines that we can just set aside whenever we wish. So as a general matter, that's one view utilitarians have about rules. I think that's not appropriate in this case. I think even though the ad bellum rules, on my view, are ultimately subordinate to the utilitarian criteria of when war is just, they also reflect widespread intuitions, moral intuitions that I think, and sentiments that utilitarians will want to take seriously because they're intuitions that utilitarians will want us to have. Because people have those intuitions, namely, for example, you shouldn't fight a war if it's not the last resort. Utilitarians want people to have that intuition because if they do, they're less likely to be fighting wars that utilitarianism wouldn't want them to fight in the first place. On the other hand, so that's my sort of intermediate position. I don't want to go all the way to a kind of rule utilitarian perspective, which would sort of efface the utilitarian criteria altogether in favor of the ad bellum principles. I think we'd want that. We'd want to get rid of utilitarianism on rule of utilitarian grounds and just had the ad bellum principles, only if we thought that would give us better results. And I don't see any reason for thinking that. So I would hang on to the utilitarian criteria to use it to guide us in the interpretation and development and refinement of the ad bellum principles, ultimately trying to work to get those principles so that they yield the results that would mesh best with the kind of ideally applied utilitarian standard. And even so, there may be cases in which, maybe relatively rare, but cases in which the answer is still not clear at the end of the day, and you might conceivably have to step out of the ad bellum framework and make some more direct appeal to utilitarianism. So I don't want to rule out that possibility.
Thank you. We have a half hour for questions. Just let us know to whom the question is addressed.
This is a comment addressed to Bill. You said when you were explaining why the utilitarian approach is appealing, that the criterion for when war is wrong on the utilitarian view is it's wrong when it would be worse for people in the world if it's fought than if it wasn't fought. And I just wanted to point out that's a rather misleading way of describing what utilitarianism says, because there are a lot of things that one could do other than fighting a war. There are an indefinite number of possible things that one could do. You're lumping all of those together in a way that I think is illegitimate in that statement, because it might be the case that war is the second best of all the possible things that we could do. And utilitarianism would say that it was wrong. And that's rather different from saying that war is wrong when it would be worse if it's fought than if it's not fought. That would in a sense be literally true of the case I've just described, because there's one option that would be better. So if there's one thing that we could have done that would count as if the war had not been fought.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand you, so you're saying it's not just it's worse to have fought this war than to have engaged in diplomacy, but it's worse to have fought this war because you could have helped develop some African country instead.
Yeah, I mean, just an example, a war of self-defense. The Canadians come across the border to invade and attack us, and do horrible things to us, like make us have health care and that sort of thing. And the utilitarian criterion is going to say, you can't fight back because the resources that you would have to use in order to defend yourself would actually do more good if deployed to cure malaria in Africa.
Well, it could be. I mean, it depends on what you think of this has come up before, the relevance of self-determination and upholding, the principle of, you might say, national autonomy. And it's conceivable that there could be cases where, I don't think very likely, but it could be conceivable that that would be less important than doing something to help malaria elsewhere.
Yeah, when you eradicate malaria, you uphold the principle, prevent people from dying of easily eradicable diseases when you do it. That counts in favor of that option.
But of course, that's not the choice you probably actually face, because you always had that ability to affect malaria before the Canadians came across, and you weren't doing it then. And something's a little disingenuous to say, well, we're not going to fight back because we could be fighting malaria instead, even though we've never done that and probably won't do it now. But I agree that it could be a case that the matter at stake is so trivial, relatively trivial, that perhaps like the Falklands Islands example that you mentioned, that you might think, well, even considering the precedential value and what Professor HURKA was saying, the failure to discourage future aggressions, even taking all that into account, it'd still be better if Britain had done something else with its money than send those troops down there. So,
Question.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you for the panel. And as I was listening, I was trying to think of some way to distinguish between and among your positions where some case might be concerned. And that might help to draw out the differences between your approaches as well. So I wondered if each of you in turn, beginning with Tom, I guess you, if you could tell us what you would bring to bear if you were called upon, as I am about to call upon you, if you were called upon to discuss what you took to be the most important features of the decision to support the rebels with their support in Libya. How would your views of proportionality or last resort utility, how would you frame the issue? What would be for you the most salient concerns in turn?
Before avoiding that question, can I just say something about distinguishing the views which was
Sure.
your underlying?
Sure.
George said he was a Kantian between two utilitarians, and I thought that was a fair comment about his left, but not such a fair comment about his right, because I was assuming while discussing proportionality that a war had to have a just cause.
Yeah.
It was a very small list of just causes. It had to be about preventing or reversing a violation of rights. It wasn't a utilitarian calculation, even of proportionality, because lots of benefits of war didn't count. It also wasn't a strictly utilitarian calculation, because some of the evils of war might not count if they were also dependent on wrongful choices by the enemy. And then in the discussion of in bello proportionality, it was supposed to matter that some of the deaths from war would be directly caused by us, namely the collateral harm to enemy civilians. So it was no way a utilitarian view. So about Libya,
How would you, your views
well,
of
I hate to say it, you're a panel late. Because the question about, in my understanding of proportionality is that the relevant goods, the relevant harms are all the bad things that will follow. The relevant goods are the just causes plus the initial just causes plus any conditional just causes. So to know how to apply proportionality to the Libya case, we have to know what are the just causes. So if it's just preventing large-scale killings of civilians, and that's all, that's the only just cause for intervening, which I think some people were applauding, then the only thing that weighs on the positive side is the prevention of civilian deaths at the hands of Gaddafi's soldiers. But if you take a more liberal view, liberal is quite the word, but if you think of a more expansive view of what the legitimate just causes in Libya are, such that, for example, regime change is a legitimate goal, then the benefits include regime change and all the good that would come to the Libyan people from that. So I really think, part of my idea was that all that counts on the positive side of a proportionality calculation is the principal just causes plus the conditional ones. And you can't decide what that involves in the Libyan case until you've decided what are the just causes. Is it just the prevention of civilian casualties at the hand of Gaddafi's forces? Is it also regime change? The suggestion was made, I think, a couple of panels before, that one of the motivating ideas of the Iraq War, that you could establish a democracy and that would spread democracy in the Middle East. So is a legitimate goal of the Libyan intervention to establish a democracy that might help spread and certainly stop the stopping of the spread of democracy? So I'm avoiding the question by saying you have to know first what the relevant just aims are.
Well, first let me apologize to Tom for tarring him with the unfairly, with the sweeping utilitarian brush. Of course, the proportionality calculations are inherently utilitarian, but he had introduced in his talk and in his paper a number of constraints on what counts. And once you've done that, obviously you've got, in fact, one way of him re-subsuming my position on last resort would be, well, this is just another one of those considerations. In addition to what are relevant goods, you have to make sure that whatever option you're considering, that you've made good a faith effort to exhaust all alternatives first. So, but this is, for me, not an issue of, for lack of a better term, philosophical sophistry about which more clever argument can be developed to subsume all the categories of just war or re-explain or reinterpret the tradition. I started, or rather focused, on a very, very important practical dilemma of my own, not the Tripoli problem, but the military technologies problem. That's what drove this. That doesn't help answer what to do about Tripoli, though it does perhaps address what to do about Iran with regard to a cyber versus a conventional attack. In general, though, by thinking that last resort is an important consideration after all to take account of, and that it isn't merely a calculus of alternatives, is to ask whether or not, in this case, recognizing that preventing the slaughter of innocents is itself a justifiable reason for coming to their defense, whether alternatives have been examined and exhausted. And the way I see this is actually sympathetic to your own concern, Professor Elstein, that we not try to over-theorize practical reasoning. This is a very practical consideration. When I say good faith attempts, I mean what reasonable people under circumstances such as I described in all those related areas of discourse where you do something unpleasant that you think otherwise you're not supposed to do, have first attempted to wonder whether there's something less drastic that they could do. And that is not a demand that one do every other alternative thing one could ever envision. And my sense is, when I was talking to some college students at a little liberal arts college in Ohio about this just a few days ago, and they were asking about Libya and what we're doing, and I said, well, I believe our president is a man of principle, and I also think that he's advised by a Secretary of State who's a classmate of mine that who's a very practical man. Who's where we have a lot on the plate right now, and it's going to be difficult to take this on, far more so than people realize. And so there was a, caution about getting caught up in this, until finally it seemed there was no alternative, that if we did nothing, we would watch something less drastic than Rwanda, but something perhaps more like what we would have seen in Kosovo if the bombing hadn't begun. And for similar reasons, the decision to avoid getting entangled in this was overridden. And I think in that sense, that was a proper application of the last resort criterion. made it clear we didn't want to do this. We hoped that there would be other alternatives, but hope, as we know, is not a policy. There really wasn't much else one could do that I can see other than allow the slaughter to happen. Now, who it is that's being slaughtered and what will happen if they're preserved from being killed is, of course, a whole other matter.
I think I'm basically in agreement with that. What I was saying in my paper is that I want to use the ad bellum principles as the basic framework in which we do the analysis of these issues. They're grounded ultimately, I think, in the utilitarian perspective, but that's still, those principles are the ones we should try to apply. So the question for me is about whether there's a just cause or not. And I don't have a well-worked out position, but my feeling is that we, as you mentioned in your talk this morning about the developing R2P norm, and I think this is an aspect of that we're evolving towards a sort of new norm of what's acceptable conduct of a government towards its own citizens. And from a utilitarian point of view, that could come to be a recognized sort of norm of international affairs and a just cause in that way. That for, if you go back to Mill's utilitarianism or you think about what Sidgwick says about it, they're very, from Sidgwick you get the idea of you have certain international duties and violations of those duties, if they can't be adjudicated, could be a just cause of war. But of course he's ultimately utilitarian, but the just cause is framed in terms of what international duties you have. And I think we have a kind of evolving norm about what those duties are. And maybe it turned out to have been wishful thinking on my part, but I think, I would like to see that norm reinforced and made a little more secure. David, I have questions for our two panelists. Would it be okay for me to?
Would you mind holding on?
Sure.
For a second?
Okay.
Because there are some people desperately waiting to
Thank you.
ask questions.
Yeah. Well, first, just a quick comment to George. Thanks for reminding us that criterion of last resort can be used in support of the use of military force, because any of us who have ever been or know this debate know that usually it is used exactly the other way. Where it's, there's still something to be done. Whether it's going to do anything or not, we don't know, but still something to be done, etc. But my comment really, question really, Mr. HURKA. First, a point of personal privilege. When I've written on proportionality, it's because of the nature of the debate that I'm in most of the time, which is with folks in the religious scene, and these people are all pacifists or crypto-pacifists, and they don't want to admit that there can ever be a possibility of the justified use of military force. So what they do is they cook the books, and proportionality is a favorite criterion of theirs because it allows them to argue like this. Oh, look at all the things that can happen that are bad. Therefore, the use of force is unjustified. And so my point is simply to say, hey, wait a minute. First of all, we have to have the other side of the equation if you're going to do a proportionality calculus. And secondly, then we can start looking at what you put in there. And I appreciate the sophisticated, careful analysis that you offered by contrast with that kind of use of the criterion of proportionality. But the question to you is, because you brought it up, earlier on there were a lot of people in uniform here, and these people are going to encounter the criterion of proportionality in rules of engagement and in perhaps dealing with the law of armed conflict. And I have rubbed enough elbows with international lawyers from various countries, Western countries, to know that there is a significant amount of difference among them in how they apply this notion of proportionality, which appears as a result of Protocol 77, Protocol 1, as one of the two criteria, the other being distinction, to deal with the hard cases, the cases that go beyond what's in the black letter law. But then you have the matter of exactly what this means. And I know that from these contacts I've had, that there's some very real differences between Americans who are not bound legally by this, but say that so far as it expresses customary law, we observe it. The Brits who are legally bound by it, the Germans who regard it as holy writ, and the Israelis who have a very different experience of combat from what most of the Western European and American nations in America have had to report with. So do you have any further comment on the relationship of these legal kinds of debates over proportionality and what you would want to say about proportionality from a philosophical perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely recognize that there's additional Protocol 1, it has got a clause about proportionality, and the different militaries of the world interpret that differently. And it causes problems for coalition fighting, because very often I think the United States has felt constrained by the interpretations of proportionality of some of its potential allies, which are more restrictive than the U.S. interpretation. So the U.S. thinks, I think the practice is that there's a coalition, you fight according to you do only the things that everybody thinks are permissible to do. And so the United States feels bound, restricted in its, the ways it can wage war if it's in alliance with militaries who have a more restrictive interpretation of proportionality. I mean, one of the problems I understand about the legal situation is there's never been a prosecution under the heading of in bello proportionality. Human Rights Watch can write reports saying that proportionality has been violated, but there's never been any legal determination.
But
so
there have been investigations.
I'm quoting a lawyer who told me this, so I bow to others' greater knowledge. But I think there haven't been definitive legal interpretations of that part of Additional Protocol 1 because there haven't been prosecutions. And it's easier to prosecute under the heading of what I call necessity. It's easier to show that you caused an unnecessary level of harm, that you could have achieved your objective in a less harmful way. That's easier to show in a prosecution than it is to show there was no other way you could have done it, but what you did was disproportionate. So I mean, those are the facts on the ground. I mean, as a philosopher, I just try to think about the concept of excessive harm and come up with the best understanding of it I can come up with. Now, you would hope that when they come to interpret the clauses in Protocol 1, they'll engage in the same reasoning. Can't be made completely precise, that they'd come up with the best answer. But they haven't done it yet. Maybe the philosophers thinking about what proportionality involves can guide the lawyers when it comes time to interpret it in a more definitive way. But I think, if I think about the issue, I'm trying to think about just as what's morally right. If I'm thinking about whether a use of force is disproportionate, how should I come to a conclusion about that? And exactly what the wording of the law is, and exactly what the existing interpretations. It's something I'll look at and I'll respect, but I'm not going to be completely constrained by it the way a legal interpretation would have to be. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but.
Thank you very much. First, as someone who's besieged by necessity to leave early this afternoon, I want to say thank you to Art and George for this fantastic program. It's, I think we've never had one day with so many useful perspectives from so many knowledgeable people. So thank you, and also thanks to George for your kind nod to our historical work. I'll tell Andrew, who edited that excellent chapter on Cicero. Just a few quick comments. First, I think that Bill Shaw's paper is useful and challenging. It's always important, though, inspired by someone like Jim Johnson, to remember that when much of the just war tradition was developed, we didn't really work in terms of what is utilitarianism and what is deontology. These are, to a large extent, conceptions developed after Kant. I have students who ask, how can Thomas Aquinas say this? He was a virtue ethicist, wasn't he? Well, that's something we thought of. So obviously in a lot of the classical just war tradition, you will find utilitarian and deontological reasoning and virtue ethical reasoning side by side. And maybe that's part of the strength of that kind of reasoning with some of these thinkers, such as Augustine as well, who Dean Alshine has written well on. Secondly, there is one thing that we haven't really talked about when it comes to harms that are relevant. Well, it's right underneath there, but I think if you look back to early Christian and medieval Christian just war tradition, they would say that's a very relevant harm, namely what happens to the soldiers, and more broadly, what happens to us when we go into war. Augustine's classical question in Contra Faustum about what is really to be blamed about war. What is to be blamed is what happens to us. Our virtue is somehow destroyed. Now, that can be, of course, taken the other way, because many have said war is a good thing. It introduces discipline and pride and patriotism. But of course, when you, in the era of post-traumatic stress syndrome, you ask, well, what are the actual results of war? They clearly count. You said so as well, that what happens to soldiers clearly counts. And I think that's relevant to Michael Walzer's excellent lunchtime talk as well. You know, what is it about the good guys that they shouldn't do? Well, maybe the good guys end up being bad guys if they start doing these things. So it's something that happens to us. Finally, we'd like to recommend a piece by Avery Claw in the first issue of last year's, surprise, Journal of Military Ethics, which is a conversation in many ways. It's Michael Walzer's argument against Asa Kasher's argument on whether we should impose responsibility to take on more risk. And it's the attempt by a commander to tell his soldier that you should go into this building, even though there would be more risk to itself, rather than us bombarding it. And I know there's more risk, but nonetheless we believe it's right. And I think that dialogue that he has there, very platonic, I think it's quite elegant. Also like to hear at some point, but we don't have time for that now, I'm sure Tom Hurk can talk a little bit about the proportionality of cost, which some people emphasize, saying that this cost isn't great enough to go to war. Sometimes ad bellum proportionality is construed in that way, rather than proportionality of ends. But I don't know if that
Responses?
Yeah, no, you can think that there's, that to count as a just cause, something has to reach a certain level of seriousness. You don't even do a proportionality calculation unless you've got something that's that serious. I could say, I mentioned that there were these conditional just causes. Another one that I didn't have time to mention was the righting of lesser humanitarian wrongs. So, you know, take the Afghanistan war. You know, the Taliban regime restricted the rights of Afghan women. And I think most people would think that a war fought just to end the restrictions of Afghan women's rights would not have been justified. It's not enough to justify war, and it's not that it was a just cause, but the war would be disproportionate. That's not enough to be a just cause. But you might think that once there's another just cause, the fact that, and just cause that permits regime change, as was sought in Afghanistan, then the fact that regime change would also improve the situation of Afghan women was a relevant benefit. Can I say something heretical about Augustine? I think that remark that what matters is you know, the effect on our virtue, I think that's morally horrible. The bad thing about war isn't that people get killed, it isn't that people get maimed and suffer horribly, it's that my soul is corrupted. I think that's morally horrible.
You know, I think you're
Right.
misstating.
Well, I'm taking it, the way it's quoted and the way it was quoted here. I agree that I totally agree that if a war has corrupting effects on our characters, on the character of our political life, if the political life in our nation will be corrupted as a result of our fighting a war that would otherwise have a just cause, that is a relevant evil to be taken into account. I just don't think it counts alongside the deaths of thousands of people.
I think Augustine could answer that.
I think you could answer it, yeah, because I think the way you stated it is fairly simplistic. It's a far more complicated argument on his part, but there are other people with hands up, so we'll talk about that.
So those darn crypto pacifists.
Yeah, so I just wondered if I could maybe try and reconcile Bill and George a little bit. So, on the one hand, so George, you're giving an interpretation of last resort that is procedural rather than the way that I would tend to think about the requirement of necessity, which roughly says don't do it unless there's no other less costly way of doing it. And so on the one hand, that kind of seems an odd way to interpret the requirement. If you think about in terms of technology, so imagine some kind of super new technology that enables us from space to zap down rays that will kill all and only those involved in a genocide, right? Complete with no risk at all to anyone else. And then you say, well, should you be restrained from using that weapon simply because there was some other diplomatic channel that might have the effect of, that seems odd, right? I mean, if you really know that it's going to have that, welfare maximizing effect, why would you have to wait into that procedural requirement of last resort? But I think that your interpretation becomes a lot more plausible when you kind of ask the question, why is it that we're consistently so bad at assessing the future costs of warfare, right? time and time again, we think it's going to be quick, easy, cost-free, troops will be home by Christmas, strap on the bomber jacket, mission accomplished.
Cakewalk, I believe is the phrase. Cakewalk.
Cakewalk, exactly. And I think that the reason for that is the fundamental insight that Clausewitz had, which I think has not been undermined by all of these new technologies, which is that war has an intrinsic tendency towards escalation, precisely because it is a form of opposed political violence. When we start using organized violence against people, they will fight back against you, and it will always be more costly than you think it is. So whatever your assessment is of likely cost at the beginning of the conflict, treble it or quadruple it. And I think that probably does push you towards giving a lot more plausibility to your procedural interpretation of last resort.
A couple of responses. I'm certainly sympathetic to that, and certainly a more intuitively plausible way of initially at least making the case I'm trying to make about last resort would be to say something like what you just summarized, David, that in fact our ability to carry out, I guess the utilitarians call them expected values calculations, is notoriously suspect. Risk analysis, if you will. No matter how elaborate the models we use, how pseudo-mathematical they may seem to us in the financial world, for example, that we tend to overestimate the benefits of the policy that we're predisposed to pursue and discount the likely risks of the downsides of those policies. And we see it enough that the utilitarian would say, on a kind of John Stuart Mill account, the collective wisdom and experience of humankind has taught us this harsh lesson. And that's, by the way, how last resort, in virtually all the literature, I didn't have time to do it here, but I had like enormous sets of quotations of what various authors have said about the last resort criterion, and invariably, if they try to summarize it, it's something like that. It's a collective wisdom of humankind has taught us that this is always worse than we think it's going to be. Therefore, don't do it, or don't do it until you've tried all other alternatives. Now, the reason that I'm worried about simply letting it lie there is that for the first time, and I think this is fair to say, the vector of technological development in warfare has invariably been more destruction and more indiscriminate destruction, from the bow and arrow to the catapult to gunpowder to cannons to nuclear war. It's been widening the specter of destructiveness and the destructive power of war. Recently, starting with the development of precision-guided munitions around the time of Gulf War I, and now especially if you listen to the rhetoric of engineers involved in the development of new military technologies in the areas of robotics, let's say, and cyber war. This is a very important argument in the cyber case. These will offer far more discriminate and less destructive ways of carrying it out. So they'll be like your death ray from space. And I would say, I mean, for one thing, it strikes me as odd that a person who is concerned about rights and subject to killing and liability to being killed in general as a concern about war would be happy with the scenario you just described, where a death ray zapped only, a handful of people who were going to be responsible for a genocide, but hadn't yet carried it out. So therefore had done nothing to make themselves liable to attack yet. So we're going to kill them surgically. I mean, it seems to me that's not entirely consistent with your own position on vulnerability to attack. Yeah, right. Yeah, okay, yes, I know we can probably sketch it, but I'd say, well, have we first, it seems reasonable to ask, is there some other way apart from killing them that we can stop this? Because who knows why they're doing this? They may be poisoned, if we're going to carry the philosophical game out a bit. They may have inhaled some kind of hallucinogenic drug by accident that was released by a chemical plant that we built to help provide for development. And who knows what's going on? And so one doesn't necessarily, either in domestic law enforcement or I think in this case, the international arena, necessarily say, oh, they're about to do something terrible, let's zap them. You first ask, they're about to do something terrible, we think, can we stop them? And if the answer is, well, no, and they're going to kill you know, hundreds of thousands of people with machetes, well, then I think your death rate comes in, but then my criterion as a procedural principle has been met. And I think that's an enormous difference. And I would also say that I think that's the way we tend to judge these matters in these other areas of exemption or exception where last resort is more commonly actually invoked, that we would do well to learn if we're trying to do what I gather to have been the past decade of just war discussion since 9/11 has been philosophers like yourselves, like you, Jeff, and others who have pointed out to the sort of community of just war theorists that were conceptually imprecise in a harmful way, in a dangerous way, in the way in which we understand many of these categories, like proportionality or just cause. And that we need to do a better job than we've been doing. I take that lesson very seriously and take the teachings that all of you have provided us deeply to heart. And I think this is simply another version of that very kind of effort applied to this particular conception of just war, which I think has been badly misinterpreted. So I do think that one owes it to oneself to do a better job than we have, perhaps, of sorting out this methodological anarchy in the tradition and getting precise on what we mean. And I think if last resort is procedural and it's a side constraint on proportionality calculations and not simply another one of them, that provides us with a very reassuring justification or sense that the vector of technological development in particular and of war making in general is not going to lead us to rely ever more heavily on warfare as a means of conflict resolution when there are other less drastic options available.
One final question.
Quick response on this last resort. It sounds to me like your response to Jean about Libya and what you said just now isn't a last resort offer, it's a last minute offer. We dither until the last minute, and then we do what is our only thing to do, and that is use force. But that's not a last resort. That's a different approach to the problem. And
Well,
that's a particularly good one.
So that's a critique of my generous assessment of the President's decision, you think? That really doesn't qualify under my own procedural criteria. That's just merely lax judgment leading to, well, perhaps. And we were actually having that argument last night with several of us, David and Jeff McCausland and others, about where we find ourselves now is a result of incompetence and indecision, or whether indeed it was a legitimate procedural concern to say, we really rather would not use force unless we've exhausted alternatives that nobody really tried. So I think that's fair. I don't know enough about who said what to whom in the Oval Office or whatever. I mean, there are rumors going around about who got to whom and made someone change their mind and what should have been done first, and I'm not privy to that, but I will accept, without giving up on my procedural definition of last resort, that maybe this particular decision isn't a good example of it.
One final comment.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think waiting isn't costless. I mean, if there's an aggressor in occupation of a territory, and you to take Michael Walsh's examples, and you send another UN mission or send another diplomatic note, it's not cost-free. The aggressor stays in occupation of the territory. He gets to build up his military defenses so that at the end of the day you have to fight a war. It's going to be more bloody and more destructive. And you have to weigh against each other. Well, what's the probability that this extra peacemaking attempt will succeed? And what's the probability that, should it fail, the consequences will be worse than they would have been had we acted now? And that's why I think last resort is a kind of comparative proportionality. What are the potential gains from trying this additional means short of war? What are the potential costs of trying this additional means short of war? How do the potential gains weigh against the potential costs? And often, the effect of waiting is to make everything much worse. And that can be known in advance.
And let's not wait any longer
Yes.
for our hors d'oeuvres and cocktails. Please join me in thanking our panel.